In January 2014, a video titled Tech Demo for Pillow Castle's First-Person Puzzler appeared on YouTube. It showed off gameplay with an intriguing mechanic using first perspective, allowing you to change the size of an object by looking at it differently. A lot of minds were absolutely blown, and a lot of people were very excited. The tech demo was called the Museum of Simulation Technology. It would disappear and resurface every now and then over the coming years, changing the art style and adding in a few mechanics, but most of the core gameplay seemed to stay the same. And at the end of 2019, over 5 years after that video, it launched under a new name, Superliminal.
Hi there, my name is Raymond and I am a game designer. That means I usually spend my time making video games and not critiquing them, but I decided to change things up because after finishing Superliminal, I was left with a lot of powerful, conflicting feelings about it. On the one hand, this game has a lot of really brilliant moments and very innovative mechanics, which I'm a major fan of. But on the other hand, it feels like the game doesn't actually work for me. It feels like the sum of its parts is much more than the whole of the game. That's of course very subjective, and I'm sure that for a big part that is because I was expecting a logic puzzle game, which, as we will soon explore, this isn't really. But this got me curious to explore where I think Superliminal falls short and how it could be doing these things better. As you can see from the video length, I've explored this quite a bit, so I've decided to split this critique into chapters and put the timestamps for those in the description. If you really like Superliminal, that is awesome. Don't let me convince you otherwise because there's a lot of really cool stuff in it, but this is just my personal take on Superliminal. This is not going to be a review with a number at the end. Instead, this is just going to have a whole lot of spoilers, basically for the entire game.
After having finished it for the first time, I felt like Superliminal isn't sure what kind of game it is. The best way I can put it is that it exists out of 3 distinct pieces of gameplay: logic puzzles, perception puzzles, and non-puzzles. The logic puzzles revolve around the forced perspective mechanic, which was shown in those early tech demo videos. It adds to this with a number of other mechanics like fans and gates, testing and expanding your understanding of the rules as you get further into the game. The perception puzzles are basically secondary sets of puzzles. They have their own logic, but usually only appear as a couple of puzzles in a row. The reason I call them perception puzzles is that for most of them, you need to look around carefully, realizing something is out of place or hiding something, instead of using logic to solve them. The third element of the game consists of non-puzzles, which are usually surreal events happening to you as you either make your way through a level or while you attempt to solve a puzzle. The reason I'd classify these as non-puzzles is that it's never something you're actively trying to solve, as it's not something you could have expected. It's something that happens to you, not something that feels like you made it happen. Many games have multiple types of gameplay. Building a base in Minecraft can be a nice break from gathering resources and running away from spiders. The reason that these different gameplay sections feel like a problem in Superliminal is that the game doesn't clearly communicate what kind of section you're in. It doesn't tell you what it expects of you. Are you meant to use the logical rules you've learned about forced perspective? Are you meant to look for something out of place? Are you even supposed to think about it, or do you just try to keep moving? In 2017, the founder of Pillow Castle, Albert Shih, was interviewed for an article in VentureBeat. In the first quote this article presents, Albert talks about this game not being as much of a logic puzzler as it is a surprising, magical, and new experience. Albert Shih is also credited as game director of Superliminal, and this quote makes it feel like the game has had a bit of an identity crisis for a longer period of time. The forced perspective mechanic feels automatically suited for a logic puzzle game, but when you see it in action, it has an immediate surreal feeling to it too. I believe that in trying to chase this surrealism, while still keeping a lot of the logic puzzle elements, they made their own jobs incredibly difficult. And in the end, this resulted in a game where the different pieces of gameplay don't feel like they combine to make a cohesive whole. So far I've talked about the game very globally, but now I'm going to take you through level 1 puzzle by puzzle. If you're still interested in trying out the game, this is your chance to play it without having a bunch of solutions spoiled for you. Alright, I will not do this for every level, but let's get into it. After an introduction cutscene tells you about the treatment, solving mental problems within dreams, you start the game staring at a wall. The controls are written on there, quickly letting you know what to use, and when you turn around there's a contract for you to sign. It doesn't tell you what button to use, but if you've played a game before, you'll probably figure out it's a left mouse button. Now you know how to walk, look around, and what button to press to interact with things. Turn around again, and the wall that previously showed your controls is gone, now presenting a door to the next room. There's some chess pawns here for you to pick up and play with so you can learn about the forced perspective mechanic, but it's not required to continue. In the next room your path is blocked by a huge rook. Solving this puzzle ensures you've learned about grabbing objects and immediately introduces you to using first perspective to shrink something. This might be overwhelming for someone who hasn't played a lot of games before, but most people that get here will likely enjoy the experience of making giant things small and small things giant. The little row of boxes in this room also ensures you've learned how to jump. The next room lets you play around with some more boxes to discover the exit and then make a makeshift stairs to it. It also shows that you can rotate objects, but that isn't really relevant yet. Next up, you'll learn about a barrier you can't take objects through, and then comes the obligatory cube on button puzzle. This is a bit of a puzzle game trope, and it feels like Superliminal knows this because it immediately introduces more. It shows that you can pick up objects from any distance, also through a door you're holding open. This combined introduction is cool, but the layout in this puzzle is odd. The cube is positioned to be out of sight when you're right on the button, only visible when you look through the glass on the side or stand awkwardly in the corner of the button. I understand this introduces you to carefully looking around, but it's strange that the first button in the game requires you to stand on its edge, and I'd argue that introducing two things at a time is enough here, even if one of them is a trope. You have to reuse this box in the next room as a stepping stone, which is nice. Getting more than one use out of an object in a puzzle is always a win. Next is the first non-puzzle in the game, aside from the wall with controls disappearing earlier. It looks like this pawn will block your way, but it's actually a 2D projection, also known as a decal, which works as an optical illusion. Visually really cool, but you can just move on. The female AI voice introduces herself here, but I'll get to the narrative later. There's another puzzle about moving objects at a distance, then rotating an object becomes important as you make a ramp out of cheese, and after that you place a huge object on a tiny button. And then there is the Room of Disappointment. The room where creativity and exploration get crushed into the ground. But we'll cover that in Chapter 5. You move another cube from one room to a button elsewhere, followed by placing a cube on the ceiling to get it past the barrier, and then there's some fun posters. There's a lot of puns and visual gags in this game, and I actually quite like them. These posters warning you not to take objects say "thank you for not objecting. People without objects will be fine." Alright, moving on. This is another room with a nun puzzle. Going through these doors loops you endlessly, which is interesting, but again not very relevant for gameplay, as you can just ignore it and continue. And then the game introduces that its objects are inconsistent. You couldn't grab any exit signs before, but this one is tilted, so it's fair game. I really don't like this. It keeps doing this throughout the game, which means you never know whether you can pick something up before you hover over it with your cursor and it shows that you can interact. If only physical objects that are not stuck to any wall can be grabbed, that would be cool. Perhaps the sign would fall off after you step on one of the buttons, and then you can grab it. But no, the puzzle itself here is quite neat though, requiring you to scale up the sign to cover both buttons. Sadly, it's really easy to position the sign in a way that it topples over, allowing you to get through the first door and then get stuck as the sign falls off both buttons, which forces you to reload the last checkpoint. Luckily, the checkpoint system is very lenient, with a checkpoint pretty much in front of every puzzle. And then you've done it! Oh no, wait, the exit is blocked. You have to scale up a piece of cheese to push the physical walls aside, which is a bit awkward, but it opens up a path. You get to continue through a garage-like environment, and the level ends with a non-puzzle of you falling through the floor. Alright, that was level 1. It basically set up Superliminal as a logic puzzle game revolving around the first perspective mechanic, scaling things up and down as you go. It's done a pretty good job introducing you to the basic aspects of this mechanic, and if you're a fan of logic puzzle games like me, you're probably wondering how it's going to expand on this, with deeper and more complicated puzzles that will test your creativity and understanding of its logic. Sadly, for that we'll have to wait until level 6. Just the first perspective mechanic isn't enough to fill a whole game. At least that's what I assume the people at Pillow Castle thought. And I don't think they're wrong. A single mechanic is cool, but if you can find complementary mechanics and combine them in interesting ways, you can create a lot more varying puzzles, exploring the core mechanic from different angles. In level 2, Superliminal introduces the first of what I've dubbed the perception mechanics. If you look at a decal from the right angle and the right location, it actually turns into a 3D object. It's not as novel as the first perspective, but it's still a really cool mechanic, and it feels like this could work really well together with the logic we have so far. However, it doesn't really do that. There are only 4 puzzles that use the decal to 3D mechanic. For the first 2, the 3D object created is a cube to be used as a stepping stone. The latter 2 reveal an opening behind what you just grabbed. You could argue the decals creating cubes is the 2 different mechanics being used together, but it's at the most basic level. First perspective isn't even really necessary. The cubes would have functioned just as well as stepping stones if you could just pick them up normally, like in other video games. But now that they've introduced these new mechanics, I'm sure they'll be expanded upon. The more interesting combinations will be coming now that the basics are established, right? No, they're not. As a matter of fact, this cool mechanic of turning a decal into a 3D shape never appears again in the game. There's one gag near the end where it looks like it will show up, but then it doesn't. The non-puzzle variant of this, where 3D objects turn into 2D projections, or when something looks like it's going to be 3D but actually it's an optical illusion, those do keep coming back. But the interesting gameplay you could achieve with this is never explored, like they suddenly forgot they could do it. Level 3 introduces a number of non-puzzles. It requires you to make stepping stones a couple of times, but doesn't really expand on the rule set of logic you have. Instead, it plays a bunch of visual gags, doing things you're not meant to expect, like, you are going to grab this cube, well, it's actually cut in two. Or, you grab this normal looking cube and are going to put it down, it's made out of a bunch of tiny cubes, how brilliant. While some of these are interesting, they don't evolve the gameplay at all. They evoke a feeling of, I'm so random, which doesn't really fit with what was introduced before. And that's the problem. If this game was a bunch of visual gags from start to end, not requiring you to complete puzzles or think outside of the box, that would have been fine. It would have been a different game, and people who were expecting a logic puzzler based on the tech demo and other videos might be disappointed. But if it made clear from the start that this is the gameplay to expect, this could have been an interesting, cohesive game. But after setting itself up as a logic puzzle game in level 1, it's become increasingly unclear what this game wants to be. Since we're talking about multiple levels, let me show you something real cool. It's a spreadsheet. I know it's exhilarating, but please contain yourselves. This shows Superliminal's 9 levels subdivided into sections or puzzles. You can see level 1 is mostly blue, which I use as the color for logic puzzles. Yellow is used for non-puzzles, and red for when a perception mechanic is used. The plus signs on the right indicate that these sections teach you something new. For blue colors, that can be new ways to use forced perspective. For the color yellow, that can be a non-puzzle you haven't encountered before, and for the color red, that is something new to do with perception mechanics. Level 1 has a lot of these plus signs, because it's introducing you to the main mechanic, and even though some puzzles are similar, they'll show you some different possibilities or limitations of forced perspective. Level 2 starts with some really interesting non-puzzles, seen in yellow here. These areas have some really strange geometry to explore, after which it starts introducing the decal to 3D object mechanic, shown in red. The 2 blue pluses for this level indicate you still learn a bit about forced perspective, but the other blue sections reuse something you already know. Looking at the overview, you can see what I meant with waiting until level 6 for more interesting puzzles with forced perspective. The levels before and after it mostly introduce new perception mechanics and have a bunch of non-puzzles. Because these perception mechanics are often introduced in one level and rarely used outside of that, there are only a couple of puzzles for each mechanic. This means some of them don't feel like they have a proper introduction, and none of them really get explored in depth. They miss out on interesting combinations which could happen with the logic puzzles or with other perception mechanics. Now that we have this overview, let's go through the different types of perception puzzles. We've already covered the decal to 3D objects mechanic in level 2. Level 3 introduces a mechanic that only gets used for a single puzzle, where objects are bound to the floor or a wall, moving as pillars instead of using forced perspective. It's not a bad puzzle, but it appearing only a single time makes it more of a gag that the cubes don't behave as you expected, rather than exploring an interesting mechanic. Level 4 is really strange. The game, which had some eerie moments but was mostly bright so far, suddenly has a horror theme with a lot of dark shadows and flickering lights. Luckily, the perception puzzles in this level use this darkness. Sometimes shadows on the wall hide the path to progress, and sometimes looking towards a light shows silhouettes which guide you where you have to go. These aren't as surreal as the decal to 3D mechanic, but they're pretty cool, and I can see them being used in a bunch more interesting situations. Apparently the people at Pillow Castle thought so too, because this is the only perception mechanic to reappear later in the game. In the final level, which is level 8, level 9 isn't really a level, everything becomes a lot more abstract, and the mechanic is used here with both white and black spaces hiding paths numerous times. It doesn't add a lot more depth, but I'm still happy they brought back an existing mechanic at the end. I'm not a big fan of level 5. It has the duplication mechanic, which I found to be the second worst introduced mechanic in the game. That's because its rules are immediately inconsistent. The first time you encounter it, it seems to, instead of letting you pick up the object you interact with, make a smaller copy of it in your direction. In the next puzzle, however, you can make duplicates again, but this time you do pick them up, and can use forced perspective. Same with the next puzzle. But then comes a puzzle I got really stuck at when I first played it. This puzzle has a big apple in the middle of a room that you can create copies of, but just like in the first puzzle, you can't pick them up. When you go up a ramp, you see a button that you have to put something on, so it clearly seems like you have to put a copy of the apple over there. The way you're supposed to solve it is by looking at the apple while it's partially overlapping the button on your screen and then interacting with it. So the way it works is actually using forced perspective, but the earlier puzzles didn't really make that clear. The puzzles that let you grab copies directly felt like they had different rules, and the one time you couldn't pick up copies in an earlier puzzle, it wasn't clear that forced perspective was used. Copies just seemed to be placed near the original. Maybe I'm dumb for not getting it, but this could have been introduced in a much clearer way. If you don't see the actual solution, flooding the room with apples seems like a possible way to reach the button. The ramp is of course there to make things more difficult, as is the fan which was put in the way. But the fan brings along its own problems. This is the first time you've ever seen a fan in this game, so it being part of the solution would make sense. You can't grab it, which seems weird, but it still feels like somehow you may be able to use it to blow apples up the ramp. However, the fan's only job is to stop apples going up the ramp. A hole in the floor would have served the same purpose just as well, and wouldn't have looked like it was part of the solution, but I am digressing quite a bit. We'll come back to this puzzle in chapter 8 of this video and see how we can improve it. There is another puzzle with duplication which I think should have been placed before the apple one just now. I won't get into it too much, but it could have taught you the forced perspective element of duplication, which would have let the apple puzzle make a lot more sense. As I said, I think this is the second worst introduced mechanic, but I actually quite like the mechanic itself. Ignoring its inconsistent use for now, it has potential to get some creative puzzles out of this, especially if there would be something like a magnifying glass that lets you create bigger copies while looking through it. Anyway, I'll ramble on more about those suggestions in chapter 8. Level 6 is finally continuation and expansion of the forced perspective mechanics, but I'm going through the perception mechanics now, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. Next up is my pick for the worst introduced mechanic in the game. Level 7 is made up mostly out of non-puzzles. At first you're teleported back to your room a number of times as you hear your alarm going off. After that, gravity shifts, which could be really cool but it doesn't really affect the gameplay at all. And next, you're looping through the same environment twice without really anything happening to it. That's just it. You loop through it and there was no puzzle. After a bunch more non-puzzles, you get to the elevator. This usually is the end of a level, but it surprises you by not ending and then presents to you the following. You're in a corridor ending in a T-junction. There's an exit this way sign as well as east and west signs, which is why this puzzle is often referred to as the east-west puzzle. If you proceed and look in the direction where the exit sign points, you'll see a brick wall, and looking at the other side shows a door you can go through. Doing so loops you back into the same area. Since looping happened earlier in this level, and last time just looping around some more was the solution, let's just try the same thing here. After doing it a couple more times, it seems which side has a brick wall is random, so you just have to see which one it is and go to the door opposite to it. At some point you're supposed to realize that it actually isn't random at all. The first door you look at is always blocked. So if you look the opposite direction of the exit sign first, you can go through the door it points at, and that will let you progress in the puzzle. This changes the number near the exit sign and sometimes flips the sign around. After doing it a couple of times, you've made it out. In another game, this mechanic suddenly appearing without warning could work. I still think it would be better with a puzzle before it, introducing the idea of sight changing things, so that you're already primed to think about sight and can come to the right conclusion more logically. But this level does the opposite of priming you for this puzzle. It just had you go through a bunch of puzzle-like rooms where the solution was don't think about it, just go. It also doesn't help that arrows are only pointing in the right direction in this game about half of the time. In short, the game is not clarifying what it expects you to do, which can get quite frustrating, especially in puzzle games where not knowing what to do stops you from progressing entirely. I want to quickly elaborate here just to be absolutely clear. I am not saying the game should tell you the solution. It's a puzzle. It should require a bit of thought to figure out what I have to do. My problem is that the game doesn't tell me whether it is a puzzle and what kind of puzzle it is. This level hasn't had any actual puzzle at all, and thinking about where I'm looking has never been relevant before. The game hasn't even hinted at it recently. What's also too bad is that the puzzle after this could have been used as an introduction to sight changing things. It gives you a cube to use, surprisingly, as a stepping stone, and when you look back to reuse it, it disappeared and reappears behind you. It wouldn't be the clearest introduction because it doesn't follow any puzzle rules, it's just a scripted event, and if you kept looking back while using the block as a stepping stone, you could just see it disappear. But at least if they had this puzzle ahead of the east-west puzzle, you might have been a little bit better equipped to come to the right conclusion. Of course, this mechanic of sight changing things is never used to solve a puzzle again. What's left are mostly one-off mechanics. Level 7 has you walking into 4 different directions, turning 3D environments into 2D walls, and level 8 starts off with placing a gate inside of another gate, the one it's connected to, which starts breaking down your dream reality. It's pretty cool, and it takes you into an abstract kind of environment that you're in for the rest of the level. Then, one of the final puzzles in the entire game seems like it's going to be using first perspective. It gives you 2 queen chess pieces, which you can place on black and white tiles to stop yourself from falling through them. But because you can alternate between the two and they don't need to be any size, the first perspective is kind of just there. Then there's another puzzle in kind of the same vein where you have to place a cube through a white door before you can enter the room. I guess the idea is that these spaces don't exist before you place something in there, which is an interesting concept, but again, it's there so briefly that there's no real exploration of it. And that is it. Those are the perception mechanics. I think the decall to 3D, hiding things in shadows, and duplication mechanics have a lot of potential, but it feels like Superliminal barely scratched the surface of what's possible with them. As you may realize by now, my main issue with Superliminal is a lack of clear expectations. This chapter is going to talk about a number of things the game does which cause or contribute to this. I've brought up before that if the entire game existed out of non-puzzles, this could have been fine. I think if there was a clearer rhythm to these, perhaps having a non-puzzle in between each logic puzzles, it might not have been an issue either. As players start to notice patterns, they'll get an understanding of when to actually try and solve a puzzle and when not to. Aside from this lack of pattern though, my main gripe with how non-puzzles are used in this game is that they often deprive you of solving an actual puzzle. Rather than a feeling of wonder about something interesting happening, you get a sense of irritation, as you couldn't do the puzzle you were just trying to solve. A couple of these could have been fun, but there are a lot, especially in the last 2 levels. There is one type of situation I wasn't entirely sure whether to categorize as perception puzzle or non-puzzle, and that's where grabbing something is your solution. I call these the grab axe puzzles, axe here being the random thing you have to grab this time. Although what you're meant to grab is well signposted, meaning there's a lot of visual hints as to where you should look, you still have to search for something out of place, like the moon or one of the paintings around your bed. So that makes it a perception problem, but it uses this a bunch of times with objects you're expected to grab, like cubes, making it more of a non-puzzle instead, letting you progress for doing the obvious. I really don't like this because of how random it is and how it muddies the way you solve puzzles. I have to give the crew at Pillow Castle credit for signposting these grab axe puzzles well enough that it was never something I got stuck at, but it still leaves you with a nagging feeling in any puzzle that isn't immediately obvious that there could be an item to grab which would magically solve it, taking away your focus from finding a logic or perception-based solution. There are a few red herrings in this game, things that look like they are part of the solution but really aren't. I've talked about the fan in the apple duplication puzzle, but there's also a puzzle in level 6 I got quite stuck at due to pursuing an incorrect path. Here you end up looking out of a ventilator, and are meant to grab this bouncy castle, which has a gate on it, and place it on the diving board. That will let you use a nearby gate to come out of the bouncy castle and progress to the next puzzle. That may sound easy enough, but my problem is that the space you look through to do this puzzle is just big enough to fit through yourself. Since you can access a bouncy castle, I assumed I could do something interesting where I would leap out from here and bounce my way to the exit. I don't think that's actually possible because I had a terrible time trying to position the castle in a way that would let me bounce around, and after trying to exploit glitches to fling myself up into the air, I looked up the actual solution. The easy fix for this would be to put another ring on the ventilator, or just make the hole the player looks out of a different shape. It shouldn't stop you from grabbing the castle and placing it on the diving board, and could even highlight it better. But most importantly, it would stop players pursuing the wrong solution. A lot of objects in this game look like you can grab them, but you can't. I assume this is because setting up objects to use the first perspective mechanic is hard, which is fair, but my issue isn't that there aren't enough objects to grab. My issue is that it's visually unclear what you can or can't pick up. This is made much worse by the inconsistent objects, like the exit sign, which can sometimes be picked up, but just as often they can't. Even the chess pawns and cubes, which you can almost always pick up, have instances where you can't. I'm not talking about when they turn into a decal, I'm talking about this cube being nice and 3D, not letting me pick it up. Some visual clarity could have made this so much better. Imagine if all the objects you can't pick up are tied to the floor. Actually, you don't have to imagine. They did it in one of their puzzles and it is so much clearer. Doing this everywhere would work quite well with the idea of a dream. Perhaps they could use this as a metaphor for someone afraid of change or letting go or something. But most importantly, it would make it clear what you can and can't grab. And that would improve this game a lot. At times, this is a pretty buggy game, especially if you end up sizing objects too far out of proportion, too small or too big, things go crazy. And the problem with how surreal this game gets sometimes, and how unclear some of the puzzles are, is that some of these bugs feel like you might have just solved the puzzle. At the beginning of level 8, when you have to bring one gate into the one it's connected to, I tried to immediately go along with the gate I was carrying. It wouldn't let me through, but I must have accidentally dropped the one I was carrying without noticing, because I suddenly came out of the gate I was just carrying, which had now become ridiculously tiny, and I fell through a crack in the floor. I didn't realize exactly what happened, but I was now in a white void, still seeing some of the place I just came from, and I thought this was how I was meant to progress. After walking a while into the nothingness though, that got really boring, so I restarted to the last checkpoint and tried it again, putting the gate into its counterpart without trying to step through it right away. When I went through it this time, the world started disintegrating around me, and it seemed like this was the actual solution. But if the clearly triggered alarms weren't going off, I might have still been unsure. Let's take a quick break from talking about puzzles and talk about two different things: rewarding exploration and story. I'm going to use the Stanley Parable as a comparison here. If you're familiar with that game, you might have already seen a lot of visual similarities, and the robotic female voice talking about what you're doing in Superliminal is also quite reminiscent of the narrator in Stanley. The Stanley Parable is a game all about discovering the different paths available to you. It's a game about choice, and features a crazy amount of branching paths. It really encourages the player to explore every corridor they see to check how the game might respond. Superliminal isn't branching at all, which is totally fine. While branching can be interesting, not all games need it, and it suddenly makes your game a whole lot harder to ever finish. But while there are no real branches, you do sometimes encounter what look like alternate paths, and that is where the Room of Disappointment comes in. Did you forget about it yet? I certainly did not. Where the Stanley Parable responds to players going off the road in almost every situation, Superliminal never acknowledges your presence off the main path at all. With one exception, the Room of Disappointment. This isn't as much the room where you feel the disappointment, but rather where you're set up to be disappointed throughout the remainder of the game. It really feels like this is the first of numerous secret areas, setting something up for later, like the first Portal game did with the abandoned areas. Especially when the robotic AI tells you not to go off the path else you may be punished, it hints that there will be more situations like this with possibly more interesting results later. As you may expect based on this video so far, it doesn't do this, and again, I think it really misses out. There are many fantastic places to have a secret or two, yet none of them have anything but a dead end. I get that they didn't add in numerous branching paths, but it stings that there is no kind of reward for exploration or being creative here at all. I feel obliged to mention that there are some elements you can interact with that have no relevance to the puzzles. Fire extinguishers and fire alarms. These are often present when you reach a dead end, and it's fun to imagine that triggering all of them will reveal a big secret, but it doesn't give you any indication of that. If there is something, I haven't been able to find it, and I'm not really excited to keep trying. Speaking of branches and being creative in puzzle rooms, there's a section in level 3 where you re-enter a room you've been previously, now on a bridge high above where you came through before. The game sadly doesn't use this to recontextualize what you've seen before or anything like that, but it does make for an interesting challenge to see if you can get onto the bridge earlier than the game wants you to. After struggling with forced perspective and exit signs for about 30 minutes, I can confirm that the answer is no, at least not without being able to glitch through the invisible walls they've made around the bridge. Sadly, that's another dead end. While exploration in Superliminal and the Stanley Parable are quite different, the stories have more in common. The Stanley Parable explores the theme of choice through its narrator telling you where to go and what to do, which is supported by the gameplay of constantly making choices and the environment of an office, a mind control facility, and more areas that relate to the theme in some way. It also has a lot of humor, both with funny dialogue and silly choices you can make, which lets it all be a little bit more lighthearted. I initially thought Superliminal didn't have that clear of a theme, but based on the opening video, it's obviously about mental health and not feeling in control of your life. It explores this more than I gave it credit for, with the female AI nagging you about doing everything wrong and the audio messages from Dr. Glenn Pierce telling you about how hopelessly lost you are. When it comes to gameplay supporting the story, I think not being in control is a feeling this game explores quite well, with all the puzzles you're interrupted from solving, and all the random things that keep happening to you. With the earlier introduced logic gameplay, I don't think this makes for a very fun experience, but if they wanted to explore something thematically, I can still definitely respect that. For the logic and perception problems, this theme still works but is a little cheap. Yes, you are overcoming problems, but that's what puzzles are, and because the puzzles don't get very deep, it doesn't feel like you're overcoming harder problems as you get further into the game. Nevertheless, it fits reasonably well. I do think a better integration of the environment and interactive objects into the narrative could have added a lot. I mostly think this is a missed opportunity because level 4 actually does a great job here. It has a horror theme, and at the end of the level you turn on the light and the creepy hallway turns into a normal cafeteria. That's cool, literally changing the way you view a space. But that's the only time it happens in the game, at least the only time I consciously noticed it. Practically all the other levels take place in nondescript rooms. You're told it's a dream you're in, but most of the time there isn't anything in the environment to support this idea or give you a clue as to the kind of dream you're having. The objects you're interacting with are mostly cubes and chess pieces, and it would have been fun if they related more to the narrative. You can interpret the chess pieces as you feeling like a pawn and the dice as life being unfair, but the narrative never draws any attention to this, which makes it feel like these were selected because they needed something and didn't really have the time to make it part of the story. Back to commonalities to the Stanley Parable, Superliminal also has quite some humor. First off, there's the AI voice.
Conclusion. Emergency exit protocol cannot proceed. Emergency exit protocol has been emergency destroyed.
And then there's Dr. Glenn Pierce, whose name I keep forgetting in spite of him mentioning it almost every time he speaks. His lines are practically all sarcastic jokes.
I'm just popping in to give you a quick update on where you are. We still don't know.
Sometimes the humor feels a little bit overkill, and the female AI can get annoying, but I really appreciate that it doesn't take itself too seriously. All in all, the story is a lot more consistent than I initially thought, and although most of what you get while playing are just funny lines, there's a running thread about you dealing with mental problems that ties it together. I'm not sure I can say it does a good job about portraying mental health or how you deal with it, but it's definitely a lot more consistent and works a lot better than I thought it did. At least that is until level 8. After putting the gate inside of its brother when you begin level 8, the world crumbles down and turns very abstract. There's a lot of really beautiful, weird scenery, and then Dr. Pierce starts talking.
Hello, my name is Dr. Glenn Pierce, and many years ago, I had a dream. I found myself in a place where I understood that each of us begins as nothing, where everything I perceived was shaped by seeing it exactly the way I wanted to. White space.
This caught me quite off guard. The character that has been saying sarcastic, unhelpful things throughout the game now very clearly is about to reveal how deep it all was in the end. He suddenly brings up white space, which is not a concept that was ever introduced before, but he says it like this is the big solution, which will let everything fall into place.
But in white space, I also faced the greatest challenge I could imagine. Because with a lifetime of life itself behind me, and all of the weight that it carried, I realized that seeing things the way I wanted to was not as easy as it used to be.
I guess now he's talking about creativity and seeing things without the connotations we've grown accustomed to, but it feels like such an undeserved twist. He turned from comic relief to dead serious. Imagine a comedy where its characters all of a sudden turn to the audience to talk about a very deep moral lesson, completely seriously without punchline. I found it to be very jarring. He talks more about how amazing this place is, and then you fall into the numbers of your alarm clock. I feel very mixed about level 8. The gameplay is really lackluster, with mostly non-puzzles and a few times you have to go into the dark or the light to find the solution. The art is beautiful, I really like these abstract spaces, and it finally makes it feel like you're actually in a dream. But the narrative really threw me off. All of a sudden the game is taking itself incredibly seriously, which is a sharp turn from all the jokes it played in the previous levels. Obviously this is very subjective. Looking online I saw a lot of people really enjoyed the ending narrative, but I guess to me it just didn't feel like the game was ready to give me such a deep important speech. Oh, and I really can't stand how often you fall through the floor in this game, and level 8 is the worst offender. Although I feel mixed about level 8, I'm very clear about my feelings for level 9. I really don't like it. As I've said before, it's not really a level, but level 9 teleports you through a number of places you've been before. Since it doesn't fade out but just does a hard cut to the next location, it feels very jarring. The narrative doesn't get any better in my opinion either. It says everything happened as it was supposed to, which is kind of confusing because he's now talking to me as an omniscient being rather than a scientist whose test has gone horribly wrong. He then talks about you coming here because you felt like you weren't in control, and that you used your out-of-the-box thinking and ability to shift perspective to overcome all these obstacles. This frustrates me mostly because of all the non-puzzles in level 8, and that while it is telling me about how I overcame this lack of control, I have no control. I am literally being teleported through locations against my will, and I don't have any say about it. To me, it also really ruins the mental health metaphor, because even if you had a big puzzle in the end, solving a metaphorical problem, it would feel odd if you're suddenly 100% cured of all mental issues. But there was no big puzzle in level 8 at all, making this transition from being hopelessly lost to everything being fine and according to plan even more odd. Again, a lot of people seem to like this ending, and if it was meaningful to you, don't let my thoughts influence that too much. I think it was the result of me already not having a great time that made this really rub me the wrong way. And with that, we've talked about pretty much everything but level 6. So, level 6. I like it. If you put level 6 right after level 1, you'd have a fun little game about first perspective. I got stuck at the ventilator bouncy castle puzzle for a while, which was frustrating, so I'd still recommend something to block you from jumping out, but I realized I was being a bit dumb and the actual solution was pretty neat. This level lets you actually use a fan as well, even though it's sadly only once. But what's really cool about this level is the use of gates. You can make the gate you enter really big to turn yourself tiny in the next area, and in probably the most impressive puzzle of the game, you can move 2 gates around, teleporting and resizing yourself through a room. I realize I've been quite harsh on this game, trying to point out all the flaws and ways I think it doesn't do a good job, but it's mostly because of how much potential all the different pieces have, like it shows in level 6. There's some absolute gold in here. They managed to find a number of really interesting mechanics which could combine into fantastic puzzles, but for the most part they didn't do it, and I think that's a shame. It's really interesting to look back through Pillow Castle's YouTube channel, seeing the early tech demo and different update videos after having played the final game. Seeing the first video is still really exciting. Even though I know what happens next, there's something about how casual and weird grabbing a huge building and putting it down on a table looks. I didn't even realize until watching this, but it feels odd that Superliminal mostly uses such small objects for you to interact with. Chess pieces and dice. Obviously, the moon is still quite big, but that's so unfathomably large that it doesn't have the same impact of a tower in my opinion either. It does really feel like all the logic puzzles with the forced perspective mechanic that actually appeared in the final game were already present in some form in this tech demo. The second video shows some different art, and you can see some of the new stuff, but it's mostly hidden behind the exciting text to announce their presence at the Game Developers Conference in 2014. Video number 3 is their summer promo video in August of 2014. This one shows a lot of different things. The art style is quite different, and I think the museum setting looks quite interesting here. It has a mechanic where you pick up and drop an object right away when interacting with it, which is similar to how the duplication mechanic works in the final product, except of course without the duplication. These look cool, but I imagine this must have been very annoying to play if you have to restart every time you don't do them correctly. The Work in Progress update #001 video, whose title is kind of sad as it was posted in 2015 and was their final video until 2019, shows only one different kind of thing. Objects automatically skill themselves when they reach their destination. This makes things look a lot cleaner, but it's understandable that they didn't keep it, because it makes it feel like a very forced singular solution, removing the feeling of creativity entirely. The next video is in May 2019, only 3 months before its release on the Epic Games Store, and shows a demo being played by the people at Giant Bomb. It definitely looks a lot closer to the final product, although numerous puzzles are still quite different than how they appear in the released version, or don't appear in the released version at all. It makes sense though, as this demo was likely made a while earlier and updated so they always had something to show. It does still make it feel like, as with many games, this was worked on until the last possible minute before release. What pains me a little about seeing this demo is that it has secrets. They're necessary for the progression, so I suppose they're not the most secret, sure, but it shows the team had been thinking of them, and I really find it a shame that they didn't put some of these in the eventual game. If they did and I just couldn't find them, feel free to call me an idiot in the comments. Looking back at these videos, I'm a little sad they didn't stick with a museum setting. It could have more clearly shown the different types of puzzles in their different museum halls. And it feels like they could have gotten a lot more out of the setting than they got out of the idea that this was a dream. As I said before though, the game mostly takes place in nondescript rooms, not particularly making use of the dream metaphor anyway, so I'm sure they could have done more with that too. But in these videos it already looks like a museum, and I think it looks pretty exciting. In this final chapter, I'm going to delve into the nefarious space of backseat designing. This can be annoying as a developer to get, as the backseat designer can say a bunch of things that feel right without really knowing all the relevant aspects the developer would know. So what feels like a good idea might actually be horrible in practice. But for a while now, I've been ranting to my girlfriend about all the cool things that could be added to this game or changed to make it more of a cohesive whole, so I really just want to get this off my plate. If you keep in mind all of these ideas have the potential to make things better, but also to make things horribly worse, we should be good to go. First off, there should be a consistent rule set about what you can and can't grab. Then let's add in some cool secrets. And the environment should be less nondescript rooms. Basically, I just want the museum back. Now let's look at the actual level layout. This is what it is now, and this is what I would propose. As you can see, all levels start off with some non-puzzles, followed by a grab X puzzle before the actual logic and perception puzzles come in. This lets us show the player a bunch of cool stuff to marvel at first, and when they get to solve puzzles, they don't have to worry about puzzles not actually being puzzles. Being strict about this separation at first also means it will be more effective if we end up breaking it later. Level 1 would mostly cover the same stuff it used to, basic introduction to your controls and to forced perspective. Level 2 also doesn't change too much, although I would introduce the decal to 3D mechanic a bit more gradually across a few more puzzles. The final puzzle would combine it with the forced perspective mechanic. Part of the decal could be on a cube you have to scale and position right to turn the decal into 3D and finish off the level. Level 3 would be quite different though. It would introduce you to using physics combined with force perspective, also letting you play with fans and potentially other objects whose properties can scale along with them. This wouldn't introduce gates just yet, but still expand a lot on the main logic. Level 4 would still be about light and dark, probably giving you some more lights to actually move around. The final puzzle would combine the decal to 3D mechanic with the light and dark mechanics, by letting a shadow complete the decal or requiring you to light up part of the room before you can turn the decal to 3D and progress. This would show you that the perception mechanics can be combined as well. Level 5 would introduce the gates. Honestly, I think a level exploring gates could work just as well by itself. I realize the tech might be quite tricky, but if you can place and grab things through gates, there will be a lot of interesting puzzles to create. This level would end with 2 gates you can pick up, as that is still quite a cool conclusion to learning about them. Level 6 would introduce duplication. These objects will need to have some clear visual cue to show that they will be duplicated instead of picked up normally. To make sure the mechanic stays consistent, you would also never be able to actually pick up the copies. Bear with me, I'm going to talk about this level a bit more than the others so far. In Chapter 3, I mentioned I would have some suggestions for the apple duplication puzzle to make it clear how the mechanic actually works, and here it is. Step 1, no fan. Step 2, put the apple in the back with a giant pit around it. Step 3, place a fence. And there we go. The idea of flooding the room with apples is gone, as copies fall directly into the pit, and if you look at the apple through the fence to interact with it, you'll create a copy closer by, letting you understand about using force perspective with the copies. Now that you understand this, placing a copy on the button will make a lot more sense. Now that duplication is clear, the player encounters gates with different sizes, just to remind them of how they work. And then the final puzzle lets you grab copies through gates. Since duplicated objects normally only get smaller, being able to do this through gates of different sizes will let you counter this, making copies bigger instead. Doing this as the final puzzle leaves the player aware that there's a bunch more options to be explored with this setup, eagerly waiting to see what's next. And then level 7 will catch them off guard with some non-puzzles. This may be unexpected given my critique so far, but after properly establishing the mechanics and having had numerous interesting puzzles, I think we're ready for a level that messes with the player. I'd also introduce the side mechanic in numerous puzzles here, with a cube that always returns to its origin when you look away, doors that only let you through if you're not looking at them, and then finally the east-west puzzle, this time after you've been properly primed for it. The final puzzle of this level would use sight and first perspective logic, perhaps using that cube which resets whenever you look away. This final puzzle should include quite a sense of skill, to make it a cool climactic puzzle as a reward for getting through a level that messed with you. Level 8 would be fairly straightforward. Combine everything. This will be a great final showcase of your skills as the introduced mechanics work together in many different scenarios. The final puzzle would combine literally all mechanics, though that may get a bit complex, so it would probably do so in stages. Level 9 would have a single final puzzle. It will be a simple action with big consequences for the space you're in and for the story. For example, looking through a gate and grabbing some of the foundation of the museum you're in. Grabbing that causes the museum to start falling apart, after which you run back through a number of rooms reminiscent of the 8 levels you've gone through. I wouldn't go for an omniscient voice telling you the moral lessons of the game, but revisiting memorable places you've been before can be really powerful. For that to happen, all 8 levels do need some distinct visual differences though, so that would be important to focus on too. In the end, you'd make your way out of the museum, either discovering that it was all part of a bigger museum all along, or you're actually free now. Zoom in on a thank you for visiting the museum sign, and roll the credits. Alright, that was it. I can't stress enough that this game has a lot of amazing things going for it, and that me saying there's a lot that could be done better doesn't stop you from enjoying it as it is. Clearly, it's touched me, as I've become a bit obsessed by it the last couple of weeks. If any of the developers of the game watch this, I hope you understand where I'm coming from, and that I'm really glad this game exists. But I also think there's an even more interesting game in there, one that I would have fallen in love with. And that's why I made this video. Thank you very much for watching. I don't have a Patreon to plug as this isn't something I usually do, but you can follow me at RoofCatGames on Twitter to see if I'm working on any new game projects or anything like that. Hope you're all well in these uncertain times, and take care.